Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Don John's Ducats by Roger Pilkington, which I have with me right here. Before we begin, I must apologise. I have been rather under the weather recently, and so if my voice sounds hoarse, or if there are more editing cuts in this video than usual, it is to avoid the coughing and spluttering from which I am nearly recovered. So I hope by next week I will be able to come to you with a clear, bright voice and a bushy tail, but until then I am having to rely rather heavily on a pot of Earl Grey tea which I have with me here, and from which I will sip occasionally. This is a pot of French Earl Grey, and I do not know whether this is the correct terminology for it, but that's what it says on the box. What makes this special is that it includes various floral notes. There are rose petals and lavender and cornflower, in addition to the black tea and bergamot that one usually expects in an Earl Grey tea. And so I hope that this will help to soothe my throat and clear my sinuses and make the video more pleasant for all of you. I have with me too my trusty mug. As one might expect, it is adorned with a Penguin Books logo and the title of one of my favourite books, My Man Jeeves, by P.G. Wodehouse. I love Wodehouse very much, and if you haven't read any of his works and are interested in finding them for yourselves, I heartily recommend the Jeeves series. They are classics. And in the early 90s there was a video or television adaptation of the series starring those two good friends, Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie, of A Bit of Fry and Laurie, and later of their own expansive careers. You may know them from Blackadder as well, and for many years Stephen Fry was the host of QI in the UK, a wonderful quiz show. And Hugh Laurie, for those of you in the Americas, he may be best known to you as Dr. House. Despite his cantankerous American accent, he is in fact British and is a hilariously funny comedian. The Jeeves stories are brilliantly adapted, and I watch them regularly. Great fun. But they are not the books which we are here to celebrate today. We are here for Don John's Ducats. So if you'll excuse me for one moment, I will pour myself a cup of tea, and then we'll get stuck in. I am, I'm afraid, one of those people who tends to take all black tea with cream. I hope this does not offend you. So I have here my creamer. If any of you are familiar with Jeeves and Worcester, you may know that there is a very famous silver cow creamer in one of the stories. For those of you who are not quite as familiar, I hope that might inspire you to find out what is so important about it. I am also one of those people who adds the cream or milk first into the cup. I find that this gives a nice, even consistency to the tea. Without having to rely on stirring with a teaspoon. The less cleaning up to do, the better. So I have my tea, and I have my book, and I have your company. What more could I need? Let's continue Don John's Ducats. When last we left the 4 crew of the Dabchick, they had gone on a canoeing or kayaking expedition, and they had found themselves swept away under a castle, or at least poor Michael and Carol had. Jill and Peter stayed above, managing to catch themselves before they fell into the dark expanse below the castle cliff. And that is where we find them in Chapter 5, A Dream in the Dark. Away from the hole, the canoe was in the gentle current of the Lesse, and, gliding below the castle of Walzin, it was soon bearing down upon the weir. Peter raised himself on his knees and looked at the concrete sill which stretched from side to side of the stream. "Don't worry," he said. "There's only an inch or 2 of water running over it. Besides, there's quite a small drop." He backed water on one side to swing the kayak sideways, and it came to rest gently against the top of the weir. Jumping out, he stood on the broad slope of the spillway with the water surging just up to his ankles, and looked quickly around. "Can we get up to the castle?" Jill asked. "There might be somebody there." Peter scanned the rocky bluff above. "There may be a track somewhere around the back, but it would take quite a while to reach the top. The windows are all shuttered up anyway." Jill stepped out beside him and swept her gaze first towards the castle, and then to the opposite shore, where a strip of meadow led back from the water's edge towards the forest. "Look!" she exclaimed suddenly. "Look, over there, by the wood. Rope!" Peter turned and stared in the direction in which she was pointing. At the edge of the trees beyond the grass stood a pile of logs, and beside them a tripod erection of 3 tall poles joined together at the top. Hanging in the middle of this simple derrick was a block and tackle for lifting the logs onto a cart or truck. "Come on," he said. He took the canoe by the bow, dragging it partly out of the river, and then ran, splashing, through the shallow water which poured over the spillway. Jill followed at his heels, and they scrambled quickly up the buttress at the end of the weir to reach the further shore. Along the side of the meadow there was a fence of barbed wire, but Peter trod one strand down and held up the other, while Jill squeezed quickly through. He himself put one hand on a post, jumped over the top, and set off at a run through the long grass. There was nobody about, and he was certainly not going to waste time finding the owners of the derrick so that he could ask their permission. If there was any explaining to be done, it would have to wait until later. That's very nice. A stroke of luck you're seeing this, he panted as they reached it. Come on, give us a hand. He looked quickly at the derrick, grabbed hold of one of its legs, and pulled at it. Jill took hold just below him. Heave, he called. 1, 2, 3, heave. Together, they just managed to lift the pole away from the stake which was driven into the ground to hold it from slipping, and dragged it a foot or two to one side. Once again, he said, outwards this time, but keep clear when it comes down. Now. And again, ready, steady, lift. At the third hefty pull, the whole erection tottered and came crashing to the ground. Peter grabbed the rope and began to haul it through each pulley of the sheaves in turn, until he had drawn it all free, except for the end which was spliced to the hook pulley. Having no knife, he realized that they could not easily detach it, and the only thing was to take the whole pulley with them. He gathered the rope in a coil and held it over his arm, with the steel hook and pulley laid over his shoulder. Off we go, he said, beginning to run towards the river. It's a good job nobody saw us, or it might have taken us a while to explain. There's not very much rope, Jill said as she ran beside him across the meadow. 60 feet perhaps, but not more. If we find it's not enough, we'll go for help. There must be a farm somewhere around, but I never saw a more deserted place anywhere. At the edge of the meadow, Peter tossed the rope over the fence, jumped the wire, and helped his sister through. They splashed hurriedly back along the weir, pushed the kayak out into the water, and stepped quickly aboard. After only a few strokes across the river and towards the cavern, Peter ordered Jill to swing the canoe round and aim for the bank of the meadow again. We need something else, he said. Pull over quickly to the shore. You can stay aboard while I get it. Jill backed on the right to turn the boat inwards, and as soon as Peter could see that the water was no more than 2 or 3 feet deep, he slid over the side and waded to the bank. Pushing his way through the scrub towards the fence, he shook one of the stout posts that held it, and then began to kick violently at the wires close beside it, until at last the staples gave way and the strands hung loose. He strained and wrenched at the post, twisting it to and fro until he was able to heave it out of the ground. It was quite a stout piece of timber, some 6 feet in length, and lifting it onto his shoulder, he hastened back to where Jill was waiting against the bank. She helped him to place it across the canoe, and then they set off once again towards the dark hole at the bottom of the cliff, Jill keeping one leg over the fence post to keep it from tipping into the stream. "What's that for?" she asked. "You'll see," Peter said. "Paddle hard," he called. "We'd better run upstream on this side, turn across the entrance, and take her across the mouth, just as we did last time. And we mustn't misjudge it," he added. "It wouldn't be so funny if we landed in there too." Jill glanced up the stream. "I'm surprised there are no other boats coming down. There were lots of canoes up at Hoyet, and we could do with some help." I expect the trade is mostly at the weekend. Jill paddled strongly until they were abreast of the hole. You don't think we should get help first, in any case? No, said Peter. Not till we've had a try by ourselves. It hasn't taken us long to get a rope. He began to back water on the left. Paddle hard on the right now, to swing her around. That's fine. Now, straight ahead. The kayak spun round and moved across towards the hole beneath the rock, with Jill touching the water with her blade first on the right and then on the left, to keep the craft sideways to the entrance. Now, back water, Peter ordered, and once again the canoe bumped neatly against the rock face, straddling the hole from side to side. He scrambled to his knees. You hold her, he said. I'll fix the rope onto the post. He picked up the block with the hook, pulled the free end of the rope through the pulley to make a noose, and slipped it over the timber. There, he said. Nothing can shift that. He paid out the loose rope into the water and let the current carry it down into the darkness under the cliff. When all of it had run out, he carefully pulled the post round, balancing it on the edge of the kayak, and tipped it into the water. He kept his hand on the hook of the pulley until the draw of the water was holding the timber tightly across the cavity. He felt the post to make sure it was firmly braced, and then let go. That's as safe as houses, he said. It overlaps more than a foot on either side, and it's as strong as steel. He leaned over into the mouth of the hole and put his hands to his mouth again. "Coming!" he yelled. "Coming!" "Peter," said Jill suddenly, "you're not going in there. I had no idea that was what you intended." "I'll slide down the rope," he said. "If they were all right, I shall be." "They were in a boat," Jill said. "That's very different from just going in just as you are. You won't be able to see where you're going." "If I can't, I can always haul back." He began to unbutton his shirt. "Peter, I don't want you to go." "It's all right. You stay here. You'll be needed to help haul us aboard as we come out. It will be a case of one at a time, I should imagine, and as soon as you've got somebody into the kayak, or even hanging onto it firmly, ferry them away and dump them on the weir, or anywhere shallow. You needn't be afraid of drifting down the hole when you come back, now that this post is across it." He pulled his shirt over his head. "I wasn't afraid," Jill said quickly. "No, I know," Peter said. "I just meant—" But he never finished the sentence, for with a sudden spring, Jill had leapt over the side of the kayak and grabbed the rope just beyond where it passed round the beam. Her hair streamed in the current as she looked at Peter over the timber. "Jill! Jill! Come back at once!" He leaned out and tried to seize her by the arm, but she pulled herself away. "Stay where you are," she said. "You know you're not much of a swimmer. Leave this to me." And without another word, she began to let the rope slide through her hands. A moment later, she had disappeared. "Jill!" Peter yelled. "Jill!" And here we have another one of these wonderful drawings, showing us exactly that moment as Jill slips over the side and Peter calls out to her. But as Peter called, there was no answer. "Jill," he said in a quieter voice, almost as though he knew she could not hear him now. "You shouldn't." He stopped and placed his hand on the rope where it ran away into the water. Gripping it, he pulled gently, and he knew at once from the tension which stretched it so tautly that she had hold of it somewhere inside the rock face. Keeping his hand on the rope, he crouched there, waiting. There was no point in shouting, he decided. Jill had been determined to go, and if she now heard him calling her, it might only confuse her. It was better to keep calm and leave the job to her. Keep calm. That was not so easy when all the others had vanished and were lost somewhere under the cliff amid the roaring of the water. But he would have to be in readiness to give whatever help he could. Of course, Jill should never have jumped in like that without warning him. Anything might happen inside the hole. Supposing she was sucked down in an eddy? Peter shook his head. He was annoyed that his sister had taken things so suddenly out of his hands. And yet at the same time, he really knew that what she had said was perfectly true. He himself was a holiday swimmer, and no more. He liked bathing, but he had never taken swimming as seriously as she had. Jill was the champion swimmer of her school, and she had taken both her bronze and silver medals in the life-saving classes. She could hold her breath underwater for more than a minute, whereas 10 seconds was as much as he could manage. She thought nothing of swimming a mile, and down below Hoy she had crossed the Meuse 4 times in succession from shore to shore, without appearing the least bit puffed by the exertion of it. All the same, he was in charge of the party and responsible for their safety, and it was not right that she should have leapt in without asking him. And yet, he knew that it was just like her to do so, not because she was rash, but because if ever there was a sudden danger or emergency, it was always she who acted at once, and without the slightest sign of fear. People sometimes thought her rather timid, but that was only because they did not know her. If there was trouble, Jill would always do something to save the situation without a thought for her own safety, while others were still talking. As Peter waited, his hand on the rope, other events flashed in quick succession through his memory. He recalled the time a year or 2 back when the Thames was swollen with the April floodwater, and the Dabchick's engine had suddenly cut out, just as she was crossing the top of the Cookham Weir stream towards the lock cut. Without a word, Jill had grabbed a line, flung it towards the bank, dived into the cold and muddy water, and secured the end round a tree on the shore, all in a matter of seconds. Without her presence of mind and her powerful skill as a swimmer, the ship might easily have been dashed against the sluice gates and badly holed. Not even Michael's quick ingenuity as steersman could have saved her on that occasion. Then there was the occasion when they were ploughing up the Scheldt against the run of the tide, and a toddler had fallen over the side of a passing oil barge. In a flash, Jill had been there in the swirling tide, and as soon as she had the little boy held above her, while Michael swung the Dabchick round in a tight circle to come alongside her. The skipper of the barge had run to the stern to throw a lifebelt, but even before it hit the water, Jill was there and had the boy in her grasp. And then there was the day on the Thames below Lechlade, too, the time when... Peter's thoughts were suddenly jolted back to the present as he felt the tension ease on the rope. He leaned further over towards the timber and pulled on the line. It lay limp in the current. Jill no longer had hold of it. He took a deep breath and shouted, Jill, are you all right? He strained his ears to catch a reply, but only the echo answered him. Right, right. He waited, then called again and again, his voice carrying the anxiety which gripped him. Should he go after her? It seemed madness to leave nobody outside and in contact with the world of daylight. But supposing she should need his help? Torn by indecision, he glanced swiftly round the river and the opposite shore, but there was not a soul to be seen. Perhaps he should go at once for the help to the castle, or anywhere, he thought. The silence was unbearable. Just then, he heard his name called faintly from within the cave. Peter! It was Jill's voice, and it sounded distant, but at least he knew that she was safe. Where are you? He called, his voice quavering with relief. It was several seconds before the answer came. Here, I may be. The rest he could not hear, and from the faintness of her voice he assumed that she must be making her way along the channel inside the cave. What he could not know was that Jill was, at that moment, lying face downward, sprawled upon a smooth rock to the side of the stream, holding her hands to the top of her head where she had struck it violently when she spun over at the bottom of the falls which led from the river outside to the great vault of the cavern within the hill. The blow had made her lose her grip, and half-dazed she had floated some way down the underground stream until the bump of her feet against a smooth rock had brought her round sufficiently to claw at the side and scramble out. With her remaining strength, she had crawled over the slippery stone and reached the smooth, flat rock. There she had raised her head to call to him, and there she had now lost consciousness and slipped into the whirl of dream and fantasy, while he kept his watch at the entrance. Peter sat back in the well of the kayak, and still holding the rope in his hand, he settled down to wait as patiently as he could. He glanced up the river and across towards the wrecked derrick, but still there was no one about. Overhead the castle stood defiantly on the brink of the rock, and there too all seemed deserted. A martin flew out from a hole high up on the cliff face, and now for the first time Peter noticed the pair of hawks circling as specks in the sky, and he followed them with his eyes as they spiraled and wheeled in the air, crying faintly to each other. The minutes dragged slowly by, and Peter pulled his watch out of his pocket. It was wet and had stopped ticking, and although he shook it violently, the second hand refused to move. He stuffed the watch back in his shorts again. It must be 3:30 at least, he said to himself. But what does it matter what the time is? If Jill can only get to them. He leaned again towards the opening and put his hand to his ear, straining to pick up the least sound from within. But all he could hear was the splashing and gurgling of the stream, where it disappeared out of the daylight and into the dark. Stretched out upon the cold rock, Jill had a sensation of floating in the air through a long, dark passage. At length she came out into a room and saw, to her surprise, that it was her schoolroom. Carol was seated at the desk next to hers, and Miss Whittaker was standing in front of the blackboard. The mistress looked at her over her glasses. "Jill Branksome, stand up and tell me what you know of the defeat of the armies of Marshal Blanchard at Hoyette." Jill rose to her feet. "Yes, Miss Whittingham," she said. A laugh went round the class. "Not Miss Whittingham, you donkey," Carol whispered. "Miss Whittaker." "Yes, Ensign Whittaker," Jill began again. Once more her companions laughed heartily as Miss Whittaker glared at her. The laughter came rippling and gurgling endlessly, until Jill found that she was not in the schoolroom at all, but in the gymnasium, where instead of the vaulting horses and bars, there were now several rows of strange machines which rippled and hissed. Looking out of the window, she saw that in the roadway a gang of men were digging a deep hole. One of them had a strange implement, a pneumatic thumper it seemed, and as he worked, the sound came up to her faintly, then louder and louder. Thump, thump, thump. The dull thudding seemed to shake her whole body, and all at once she began to fall, plunging and reeling over and over down towards the big dark hole in the roadway. Thump, thump, thump. The pneumatic machine drowned the hissing of the machines inside the gymnasium, and all the while she was hurtling faster and faster towards the ground. Above the din she heard her name called, and looking up, she saw that Carol was soaring as a speck far above her in the orange sky. "Jill! Jill!" It sounded like the cry of a buzzard. Now there were two buzzards, both calling with the same plaintive cry. Jill tried to call back to them, but though she opened her mouth, no sound came from it. She was falling faster than ever now, and the workmen around the hole looked up and scattered as they saw her dropping down to earth. The hole they had dug was so deep that she could not see the bottom of it, and she was just about to plunge headforemost into it when a bronzed lad in a check shirt and nautical cap brushed the workman aside and leapt forward. "It's Jill!" he shouted, and right at the brink of the abyss he stretched out a strong hand and caught her by the arm just above the elbow. As he did so, the road thumper came to the stop, and the roaring of the machines inside the gymnasium was stilled. Everything was suddenly quiet. "Jill," said the young man, and his voice seemed strangely like Michael's. "Jill, it's us." Slowly she opened her eyes. The roadway had vanished, and she seemed to be in darkness, but she still felt the grip of the young man in the nautical cap firm on her arm. She stirred, and in the dim glimmer of light which shone from the rounded spot, which was, in fact, the opening of the cave, she saw that he was kneeling beside her. And yet suddenly she realized that it was Michael who was holding her tightly by the arm. She sat up. "Where am I?" she asked, looking around in the gloom. Michael laughed. "What a question! We've been hunting for you everywhere." Carol bent over her and took her hand. If the light had been brighter, Jill might have noticed that her friend's eyes were moist, for she had almost wept with relief when Michael had come upon the form stretched out on the rock. Carol swallowed, but her voice quavered a little as she spoke. "Poor Jill," she said. "Where am I?" Jill repeated. "You're here, with Michael and me. You're safe. But what happened? We saw you come through the hole, and then you disappeared." "The hole," said Jill. "The hole. Yes, I remember." She felt her head. "I think I bumped myself and felt dizzy. It's all right now." She started to struggle to her feet. "Don't stand up," Michael said quickly. "You'll bump yourself again if you do." Jill was wide awake. "Hadn't we better get going?" she said. "Where's your canoe?" "I don't know exactly," Carol said. "We couldn't see where we were paddling, and so we pulled it up on the rocks and crept up here little by little on our hands and knees. It's not so bad here, because you can see things silhouetted against the opening, but further in it's as black as pitch. You have to feel in front of your face all the time if you don't want to have your teeth knocked out by a stalactite. Michael led the way when we were looking for you, all along the side of the stream. It was easiest to keep to the water," he said. "It's not very deep up this end. I think that's our best way out, too." Carol put her hand on Jill's shoulder. "Are you sure you're all right?" Jill rubbed her eyes. "Yes, I think so." She shook herself. "I'm fine. It was just a sudden knock." "You lead on, Michael," Carol said. "Jill can follow you, and I'll bring up the rear." "There's a rope somewhere," Jill said. "It's up by the hole." "Good," said Carol. "Now, gently here. There's no hurry, and whatever you do, don't stand up. If ever I go potholing, I'm going to buy myself a crash helmet first. And indeed, if any of you are interested in spelunking, a helmet would be a good thing to find." Cautiously, Michael led the way as they crept over the smooth, damp boulders and the rippled slabs of stalagmite, which ran with water back into the stream. The bottom seemed to be a mixture of mud and gravel, and here the going was easier. "Mind this," said Michael, and Jill could see in the light shining from the entrance that a massive stalactite hung down to within a foot or two of the water. She ducked and crept underneath it. "Why, we're just there," she said. She could now see by the light reflected from the bubbling water that the mouth of the cave was not so far away as she had thought, and was at the top of a short and irregular waterfall. When she had slid inside holding the rope, it had seemed as though she had fallen through the water for 20 or 30 feet, but now she realized that the drop had been no more than a third of that distance. All the same, to slip down a fall was much easier than to force one's way up. And Michael, too, realized that the actual exit from the cave was going to be the most difficult part. The waterfall was not vertical, but a formidable amount of water was surging down it. At the foot he stopped, looking up and over the crest to where the second kayak lay across the hole, with Peter's form silhouetted against the sky. He was not looking in their direction. "The rope must be there," said Jill, squeezing beside him. With one foot she began to feel in the water which was up to her waist, moving the toe of her shoe across the bottom. Something brushed against her leg and she bent down to grab it, but it had gone. "I thought I felt something," she said. "It was probably just a stick." "There are some queer things in here," Michael said. "I've no idea what they are, but farther in there are lots of them. I nearly caught one in my hands, and it felt springy and queer and sort of scaly. It wasn't a fish, I know that." "Probably a weed," said Jill, still feeling for the rope. "No, it wasn't. It wriggled or sort of flipped. What could it have been?" "I suggest we leave the biological discussion until later," Carol said. "What we want is the rope. Here, let me have a go." "I've got it!" cried Jill, hooking up her foot and taking hold of the line with her hands. She pulled it hard, and immediately Peter sprang to his knees, nearly blocking the entrance. "Sit down," Michael called. "Sit down. We can't see." Peter seemed to understand, for he moved quickly to one side. "Stand by," called Michael. "Here we come." "You first, Carol," said Jill. "No, you go. We'll help from behind." "I'm better at the end," Jill said. "Michael can go first." "Ladies first," said Michael. "Beside, Carol was first in, so she ought to be first out, too." "Here's the rope," Jill said. "We can all take hold of it, one behind the other." "You go first, Jill," said Carol, "if you're not feeling very good." "I am," said Jill quickly. "Go on. Let's get out of here without waiting any longer. Take a deep breath, then haul for all you're worth. I'll be behind you and you can shove down with your feet on my shoulders. Are you ready?" Carol could feel that Jill was determined to come out last, so she did not attempt to dissuade her any further. She stepped up to the foot of the narrow torrent, and above her the water flashed, translucent and green, where it cascaded over the sill to sweep into the cave. "I'm ready," she said. "Now!" Jill heaved her upward, and hand over hand she struggled to haul herself up against the force of the stream. Her head went under, but still she pulled ahead, hand by hand, kicking with her legs at the same time. Jill braced herself sideways between the rocks, caught one of the legs, and heaved again. "Keep going," she said, though Carol could hear nothing above the roar of the water. One of Carol's hands appeared above the surface, waving to and fro as though trying to grab some support. The hole darkened as Peter leaned right out from the kayak, supporting himself with one hand on the timber. He stretched forward and just managed to seize Carol's wrist. Straining backward, he pulled, and as Jill gave an extra heave from below, he drew her out into the entrance. Carol's head bobbed up above the surface, and she took another quick breath. "Don't let go yet," said Peter. "Here, can you get your other hand up to the beam? Good. Grab hold of that hook." He let go of her wrist and leaned out again to take her under the armpits. "Pull when I say," he said, "and get hold of the edge of the canoe as soon as you can. Ready? Heave!" This time, their combined efforts brought Carol's head out beyond the timber, and she lay with her chest on it, spluttering and panting. Peter still held on tight. "Can you bend a leg up, right over your back? That's it." He took hold of her ankle. "You lift at the front, and I'll pull. 1, 2, 3, up!" Carol felt the joint of her ankle crack as Peter tugged, but hauling with one hand on the kayak and lifting herself with the other on the beam, she slid forward. Still holding her by the foot, Peter tumbled back into the kayak as she sprawled on top of him. She choked, as much with relief as with the water she had swallowed, and blinked at him in the bright light, then broke into a peal of wild, almost hysterical laughter. Quickly she pulled herself together. "Sorry," she said as she struggled to her knees. She swept the wet hair back from her face. "It's good to be out again." "I'll dump you on the other bank," Peter said. No, I'll help." "We can't all get in this canoe." "No, but I'll help you with Michael. When he's out, I'll swim for it." Peter leaned into the hole again. "Next gentleman, please," he called. "Michael's a bit shorter," Carol said. "I'll lean in if you can hold me from slipping." "We can't both lean in," Peter said. "We'll sink the canoe. But if you balance it by putting your weight on the outside, I can reach further in. Here, pass me my shirt, quick." Carol handed it to him, and he twisted one of the sleeves round his hand before gripping it. Then, the moment he saw Michael's hands within reach, he floated the shirt down against them. Michael grabbed the cloth with one hand, but kept the other on the rope. "Heave," said Peter. As he did so, Carol seized him by the belt and leaned outwards, pressing with her feet on the thwarts of the kayak. There was a cracking sound from the wood of the frame, but at the same instant, Michael came wallowing over the wooden bar and right into the boat. Carol let go of Peter and slid quickly over the side, pulling herself along to the bow. There she lifted her legs, planted her feet against the rock, and pushed out powerfully on her back into the stream. Swimming with an easy back crawl, she was nearly across at the other side before Peter and Michael had disentangled themselves. Michael grinned. "You don't know what you've missed," he said. "It's wonderful inside there. At least, it would be if it wasn't so dark." He knelt up, dripping. "Do you want to go in and see for yourself?" Peter could not help but laughing. "I'll paddle you over, and then come back for Jill. Is she all right?" "She is now," Michael said. "I think she had a nasty knock." Over at the shore, Michael jumped out, but Carol insisted on returning with Peter. "You'll need help," she said. "Jill has nobody to push from behind as we had." Peter paddled back to swing the kayak once again across the hole. "I think this one is not going to be so easy. What should we do?" "We could always get her to tie the rope under her shoulders, and we could drag her up that way, perhaps." The canoe bumped against the wooden post straddling the entrance. "Good idea," Peter said. I'll call down to her to—" But suddenly he jumped up, dropping his paddle to the well of the boat. "Look!" Just inside the edge of the cave mouth, the water was breaking over Jill's arms, as inch by inch she hauled herself up to the surface. He sprawled right across the log and gripped her tightly under the arms, while Carol hung on to his legs. Jill's face appeared above the water, her hair tangled over it like seaweed. "Crawl up over my head," Peter said. "Good girl. Take hold of my belt and drag yourself out." The steel pulley pressed painfully into his chest as he lay half in the water, and Jill slithered up his back to roll over into the canoe. He pressed his hands on the post and wriggled back beside her, and once again Carol slipped out into the stream to take her weight off the canoe, which by now had an inch or two of water in it. Peter looked at his sister. "I don't know how you did it," he said. And then he noticed that high on her forehead there was the bluish and swollen lump of a severe bruise. "My goodness, you have had a bump." It's nothing," she said, feeling it gently with her hand. "It might have been worse." She tossed back her hair. "What now?" she said. "The other canoe has gone." "We'll take up the rope and the post. Then we'll row over to the others and hold a conference." "I'll help," said Jill. She took one end of the timber and pulled it across the kayak when Peter lifted it. "Now for the rope," he said. "There, all aboard. You don't need to paddle, I can manage." He shoved out, took several strong pulls with the blades, and the canoe slid across the stream to where Michael was standing up to his knees in the water to help bring it in. "20 minutes later, the post had been dropped back in its hole, and the block and rope returned to where the derrick had stood. Peter and Michael had tried to lift the affair back onto its legs, but they had been obliged to give up the attempt. "It needs 3 or 4 men," Peter said as he dropped down in the grass beside Carol and Jill. "Never mind," Michael said. "They'll easily put it up again when they want it. They'll probably think it was struck by lightning." "What do we do now?" Carol asked. 2 can go by canoe," Peter said. 2 will have to go back some other way. I can walk over the weir and find a house somewhere. There must be 1 or 2 near the castle. I think it's a case of telephoning for a taxi." "That might cost quite a bit," Michael said. "It can't be many miles to Dinant." Carol said, "I think you should do that, and I'll take Jill back with you by car." "Why me?" said Jill. "I'm all right. I'm quite ready to paddle a canoe down to the bottom." "I'm sure you are," Carol said. "Still, if there's a chance of a lift right back to the Dapchick, I think you should take it." "And you go with her," said Peter. He was not at all sure that Jill's bang on the head was as slight an injury as she made out, particularly after Michael had told him, on their way across the field, that they must have searched for 10 minutes until they had found her unconscious. He nodded to Carol to show that he wanted her to take Jill and look after her. "Right," said Carol. "You go over and fix it up, Peter, then come back and tell us. Jill and I can wait for the car and drive straight back to the boat, and you and Michael can finish the course, dump the canoe, and get back to Dinant sometime. We'll expect you when we see you." "It's a pity about the other canoe," Michael said. "If we had a light, we could have found our way out with it." "You would never have got it up to the entrance," Carol said. "Do you think we'll have to pay for it?" Michael said. "We can see about that in Ducat," said Peter. "A canoe like that might be pretty expensive," said Michael. "I vote we mount a salvage expedition tomorrow and get it back again." Carol stared at him. "You mean go inside there again?" "No, thank you." "It would be all right with lights and ropes and all that sort of gear," Michael said. "And as this is a cruise meeting, I move the resolution that the ship's company return to the Les tomorrow to recover the lost canoe. All those in favour, put up their hands." He raised his right arm straight above his head, and to his surprise, he saw Jill raise hers too. "Jill, you can't be serious," Peter said. "Those against?" He lifted a hand, and so did Carol. 2-2. "Then the item is deferred to the next meeting of the ship's company," the skipper said. He turned to Jill. "Surely you don't really think it's a good idea?" Jill, who had not spoken until now, looked up. "I'm not sure, but it might be. After all, that canoe is certain to cost us a lot." "I expect it's insured," said Peter. "Well, perhaps." She was silent for a moment. "I think we'll see how we feel about it tomorrow, don't you?" "Agreed," said Carol. Peter stood up. "I had better be off to see if I can find a telephone, or we shan't be back on board for supper." "We're not going to be," said Carol. "I think we've done enough work for one day. When we get back, we'll change and tidy up, and I'm going to treat you to a meal out by way of celebration." "Hooray!" said Michael. "That's lovely. But what exactly are we supposed to be celebrating?" "Lots of things," Carol said. "For one, you and I winning the competition. We went quite a long way with our eyes shut." "I'm not sure we should celebrate that, if it meant losing the kayak," Michael said. "Let's celebrate Peter and Jill not losing theirs." "And Jill's coming out to the cave to fetch us, and Peter hauling us out," added Carol gaily. "Oh, there are plenty of good reasons for going out for the evening." "Including the fact that we might think of trying again," Jill said wistfully. "Just think, for the price of that canoe we could dine out every night of the week." And that marks the end of Chapter 5, A Dream in the Dark. A name which seems very reminiscent of Riddles in the Dark from The Hobbit, another book which I have a great affection for. I guess we will find out what happens tomorrow when the crew decides whether they are to return and try again to rescue their lost canoe, or if they give it up as lost. Which do you think it will be? I look forward to finding out with you next time on Soft Stories. Until then, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.